So I'm just going to, I meant to mention it to you, Jordan, but I'm just going to set the stage a little bit on, just before we read Jonah chapter 3, and which is in here, and we've been wandering through this book of Jonah in our church in the large gatherings. And what I want to do is just walk us through some contrasts that are in the chapter. And I mean, have you ever had an exam, just to get you into that compare and contrast space? You know, maybe in high school, maybe you went for further miseducation for more years, and you had exam questions like compare and contrast the blah 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 with the yabbity dabbity doo, you know, something. Not exactly like that, but you know. Do you have bad memories of compare and contrast? Any? Yeah, it's shaking. Okay. Yeah, you know, I mean, you kind of hate those questions because they're quite wide open. You don't have to check all the boxes kind of questions, but they're great ways of inviting you into looking into something. And so in Jonah chapter 3, there are some wonderful contrasts that struck me as I prepared to speak on this. And in this case, they're much to teach us about, you know, ourselves and God. And just in case you're not really up on Jonah, he was a close friend of Oscar. No, I'm just... yeah, Jonah. So Jonah is this God's special messenger who's called by God to go to his archenemy, the Assyrians, in their capital city of Nineveh, which is sort of in the modern-day region of Mosul in northern Iraq. You might hear that in the news from time to time. And the message he's been called to send, and he's sort of in the late 8th century BC, a long time ago, 780, 790 BC. And the message he's called to send is that basically tell them God has noticed their bad behavior, right? So Jonah is not really fine with this idea, you know, so like, you're asking me, because the Assyrians in 50 years would actually destroy the northern kingdom of Israel. But so they're enemies. So Jonah's sort of, you can imagine saying, you're asking me to go to my arch enemies, to call them out on what they're doing, with a view, it sounds like, to having mercy on them, which we sung about. Are you kidding me? Right? And in the Monty Python theme that I'll just refer to a little bit, you can imagine Jonah saying, not bloody likely. I'm not going to do that, no matter who you say you are. Anyway, so he basically does a 180. Instead of going to Nineveh, he goes the absolute opposite direction. He gets on a ship to escape. The ship gets into a terrible storm, and confronted by the sailors, he says, you know, actually, it's my fault. It's not you. It's me. And your solution to getting out of this dilemma, which is threatening your lives, is just to throw me overboard. And since we're a small number here and we need to work together, I have some lines for you. And so the sailors' lines were, heave ho, over the side you go. So we do that 3 times. Heave ho, over the side you go. That's 1. Heave ho, you get the actions. Heave ho, over the side you go. 2, heave ho, over the side you go. 3, and he falls to his death. No. He survives the fall and drowns. No. He falls and is swallowed up by a great fish that we're told that God ordered up, probably on Amazon Prime, same-day delivery. So Jonah is, you know, the storm dies down, and then the fish has some lines like I'd like you to help me with. It's very similar, but they don't have the ho. They have heave, out of my belly you go. Can we do that? Heave, out of my belly you go. I'm setting you up for a great scripture reading. Heave, over my belly you go. You know, and then you might have heaved in your life at times. And he pukes up Jonah out of his belly, which quite nicely sets up Jonah chapter 3. And Jordan, who's going to read it. This is the chapter, you know, that Jonah said, this chapter really makes me feel puked up. Jonah chapter 3, the word of the Lord, by the way.
Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time. Go to the great city of Nineveh, and proclaim to it the message I give you. Jonah obeyed the word of the Lord and went to Nineveh. Now Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. The Ninevites believed God. A fast was proclaimed, and all of them, from the greatest to the least, put on sackcloth. When Jonah's warning reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, took off his royal robes, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat down in the dust. This is the proclamation he issued in Nineveh. By the decree of the king and his nobles, do not let people or animals, herds or flocks taste anything. Do not let them eat or drink. But let people and animals be covered with sackcloth. Let everyone call urgently on God. Let them give up their evil ways and their violence. Who knows? God may yet relent with compassion and turn from his fierce anger, so that we will not perish. When God saw all that they had did, and how they turned from their evil ways, he relented and did not bring on them the destruction he had threatened. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks. So if you have that open, we're just going to walk through, but just in contrast. So just to get us in the mood, is there any contrast that jumped out at you in that? There's no right answer, but I just thought we'd get into the mood of it. So I'm just going to walk us through. By the way, contrast, this is why you might hate those questions. Compare and contrast, great ways of being invited into, say, lyrics, or poetry, or literature, or the Bible. So, when you read the Bible or study it, don't check your analytical brain at the door, right? These compare and contrasts are sometimes insignificant, but sometimes quite significant. So that's just my encouragement to think in that way as you read the Bible. Anyway, so contrast number 1, I'm just going to walk through quickly 4 of them that struck me, is introduced in verse 1, and which goes, the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, right? A second time, and then contrast that with the response of the so-called bad enemy outsider people, the Ninevites. Did they need a second chance? No, they kind of respond right away. Or to pick up the Monty Python theme, do they need a second chance? Not bloody likely. No, they respond right away. God's special person has trouble. He needs a second chance. So I find that an interesting contrast. The insider, who should have it sort of together a bit more, needs a second chance, but the outsiders kind of get this message right away. Now, last time we gathered in church in the larger than us today, when Sarah was speaking, she encouraged us in that she was in the belly of the whale section of Jonah. And so she encouraged us in this whole business of, God is in the business of wanting to keep the conversation with us going. And we shouldn't make efforts to go out of our way of shutting it down. Because as this contrast illustrates, God is not a one chance, two chance, one strike and you're out kind of God. With God, there are always chances, always options, always, always. And as I reflected on this, and you might find yourself in this space today where you think either A, you're done with God, or you feel God is done with you, or someone's told you that God is done with you, or you're in this posture of thinking about God as someone, some being who is always looking for us to screw up and gets this perverse delight of saying, aha, you screwed up once more time. But I mean, whatever you find yourself in, Sarah, again, I just wanted to let this image she had have some, time again. And she recalled how a friend of hers said she had a picture of Sarah, who was speaking last time, and this whole business of how we think of God. And she said, this friend, she says, I saw you running down the beach, sort of laughing with God. I don't know if it was with Jesus in particular. But that sense, she was totally herself, totally free, and she and God were laughing, right? And so I think as you think through this contrast, my encouragement to you is, I don't know what your picture of God is like or what space you're in, but could you even imagine you running down the beach in conversation with, laughing with God, being fully yourself and fully you're free? That's just a lovely image for me. C'est possible, mes amis. C'est vraiment possible. Which, of course, if you have to preach in Canada, you have to do it in 2 official languages. Anyway. Contrast number 2 is a kind of an obvious one, but the contrast between the one, Jonah, recently puked up messenger of God, and in the words of verse 3 here, Nineveh. Now, Nineveh was a very large city. It took 3 days to go through it. And in the last verse of Jonah, it says this was a place of more than 120,000 persons. To me, that's an interesting contrast. It just highlights, again, never underestimate the power of 1 plus 1 with God, right? Never short sell that. You take Open Way, for example. I mean, how did this begin? It took 1, Beth, and 1. And both of us had this sense that God's call was on us, and this was an obvious thing that we should be doing. It was to be a thing. And now Open Way exists in thousands of countries and planets around the system. The asteroid belt. There are communities of Open Way. No, I'm just kidding. It's kind of funny. God's sense of humor. Or L'Arche communities. I don't know if you're familiar with L'Arche communities. Whose mission is to make known the gifts of people with intellectual disabilities. And there are now 10,000 members. I just looked at their website. There's a large community in Burnaby here, where you live in community. People who have intellectual disabilities and other people who live together, and they celebrate the fact of the gifts of everyone in particular. 153 communities, 38 countries. How did it begin? Well, Jean Vanier, who came out of privilege, was one of the son of the former governor, one of the former governor generals of Canada, started living with 2 people with intellectual disabilities, Philippe Seux and Raphaël Semi, in Trolly-Breuil, France. Right? Interesting. Again, I'm not sure where you're at today, if you're discouraged, maybe you're weighed down by how things are, maybe the work ahead of you to get to a better place, deal with stuff you need to deal with. Who knows, maybe a relationship needs to be brought to some kind of closure or some kind of understanding, or maybe there's a destructive behavior. You find yourself maybe not with substances, but the use of your time, you've sort of lost control of that, and the anti-social media is taking too much of your life away. Whatever. I just want to encourage you that this contrast, never despise the day of small beginnings, right? That single step with sort of God's help, you never know where that might take you, right? Anyway, contrast 3. This is an interesting one. Is God's original message, which if we go back to, let me just read it. This is what the initial call to Jonah was. This is the first time. God said, "Go to Nineveh, cry out against it, for their wickedness has come up before me." Okay? So that's the initial call. And then, here we have in verse 4, if you have a look at it, how does that sound like when Jonah says it? Jonah began by going a day's journey into the city, proclaiming, here's what he said, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overthrown. Game over, Ninevites. You're gonna die. Right? Does that sound like exactly the same message? No bloody way, to me at least, in my Monty Python moment. The first message, there's a sense, God is calling them. Say, go to them and say, I've noticed, I'm calling you on your crap. Because God wants us to flourish, to be in a way of living and being, like with shared practices, that our lives are richer for it. Jesus said, I've come. Why did Jesus come? That you might feel guilty? No. I've come that you might have life and have it abundantly, have it to the full. And here, Jonah's take of that message just gets a harder edge. Not just condemning him on that crap, but calling him on that crap, but there's sort of a condemnation, Not just God has noticed it, but, you're basically toast. You're condemned. And a big, big difference between calling people out on something and condemning them, right? And I often think, God's greatest hits, some of the greatest hits verses in the Bible, which in my tradition, growing up, there's a verse called John 3:16, it goes like, "For God so loved the world that God gave his one-of-a-kind, only begotten Son." And just a little footnote, the idea of only begotten or son is not just to say sort of, this is a way of talking about them sharing the exact essence, or in some of the creeds, true God of true God, God of God, that kind of thing. And our Islamic brothers and sisters, quite naturally, I've had conversations with them, and this is one of their critiques. We don't like this talk about Jesus being the Son of God, because the crass way of phrasing that question is, who was God having sex with to have a son, right? And it's a valid criticism, use that language, but I just sort of think if we think of it as a way of saying they are of the same essence. Anyway, God so loved the world that God gave his one-of-a-kind Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, should not be in a place where life is not flourishing, but should have everlasting, not just life after death stuff, but the kind of life that God enjoys here and in the future, because God's life, by definition, whether you believe it or not, would be a life that cannot die, or else it's not God's life. But that's just my mathematical brain from days past breaking into it. But then, so there's that John 3:16, the greatest hits. I would say, so what does John 3:17 say? For God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him. You get that? The insider here hardens the message into a message of from calling out to condemnation. There's a great difference between calling out and condemning. And it's interesting, I think it was the last time here, there was a visitor that had been brought, and I just happened to have a short conversation, and she said, "Wow, this is great. No one told me I was going to hell right away because I was queer," right? I mean, she just volunteered that. Or, maybe someone has told you that you've missed the train, because of X, Y, and Z. You are on the route to hell. And I think we need to remind ourselves, that is not God speaking. God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the Son. God might be interested in calling us on our crap because, unlike you, I am not perfect, right? There's stuff that needs work. But God is not interested in condemning me, sending me to hell. And I think that also goes two ways. The song we just sung. We need to check our attitudes towards our enemies, because very easily, don't you find it? Instead of calling out our enemies, I don't know who they might be, politics, maybe in family, community, workplace, we kind of like condemning them. It's an interesting line that we can easily, we just need to be reminded, we shouldn't send them to hell right away. Definitely we can call them out, but don't send them to hell. The final contrast, which is related to this one, is it's the interesting contrast I found between the outsider king's insight in verse 9 into the possibility of mercy with God, again, which we sang about earlier, contrasted with Jonah's kind of harsh condemning words. 40 days and you are toast. Because verse 9, let me just read it to you again. Who knows? This is the king. God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. And it says, when God saw what they did, how they turned from the evil ways, God relented. In some translations, it says God changed God's mind and did not bring the destruction God had threatened. God may relent and change God's mind. Who knows? It's the king. That's his contrast, whereas Jonah has a much more static, condemning kind of message. And questions in this book are interesting. Spoiler alert, the book ends with a lovely question, but I'll leave that to Beth next time. And, the outsider's right, because it saw what they did. God changed God's mind, or relented. Who knew? Now, I think if you and I were charged with being the custodians of this scripture, just imagine, right? Because it's come, people have written it down, it's been saved, and it's been translated. I imagine we would have been tempted just not to include this business of God changing God's mind. Because it's kind of a disruptive notion, right? Oh, God changed God's mind. That's, I don't know about that. Let's just edit that out so that for thousands of years, people are not disturbed by it, right? It's a nice sanitized version. No, but it's in there. So if the idea of God relenting, or talking about God that way, bothers you, I think, there's no easy way to say that. You just have to suck it up. Let it disturb you. Let it disrupt you. Because mercy is that disturbing, disruptive posture of sort of changing behavior. And I think the closest we can get to mercy on a day-to-day basis is probably empathy. Having empathy for others. You've probably heard the saying, everyone you meet is fighting some kind of battle. You don't know. And I just finished reading a book called Breakfast at Sally's. It was actually written by a homeless person in I think it's Tacoma, Washington, just south of us. Sally's, of course, the Salvation Army. But he tells the story of his fast journey into homelessness, living in his truck. And to me, that just illustrated again. You might, it's tempting to blow off homeless people. You'll see some people who are on the fringe here, if you come with us later to Dose, House of Doses, to write them off, But that story in that book, Breakfast at Sally's, he just insight. There's a lot of brokenness and dysfunction there, but it's an amazing amount of empathy and mercy within the homeless community. It's just a real encouraging kind of read. And my daughter, in this, I'm just giving you examples of empathetic behavior. She says, when you pass a panhandler, I always look them in the eye. Even I rarely give them money. Smile at them, look them in the eye. This person is dignity, made in the image of God. A practical example these days is, if you find yourself on public transit or in a public space, and there's a Chinese-looking person coughing, is your default posture going to be empathetic, or are you going to make some move away? Because, they might be carrying the coronavirus. Right? There's a bit of that. But the empathetic thing, stay seated where you are, or what have you. I think there are all kinds of scenarios where we can enter into sort of this outsider king's insight into the mercy of God, and for us to kind of walk mercifully with other people. Anyway, those are some of the contrasts. You probably maybe will notice some more. But in summary, so just these four lines, the contrast that teaches us that with God, really there are always options, always possibilities. God is passionate about a life-giving connection with us, that we flourish. It's not over. It's never over. Who knows? You might be able to see yourself running down the beach laughing with God, right? That's a lovely image for me. Thank you, Sarah. The other contrast, between one and the many. Never underestimate the power of one with God. And so don't despise those steps of small beginnings in the long journey we take into wholeness. The contrast that reminds us, while God is interested in calling us on our crap, God is not interested in condemning us. And so too we, in our posture to others, even when we might be calling people on their crap, let's be careful we don't condemn them and dismiss them. And the contrast for this last one reminds us that God is all about mercy to the point of changing God's mind, relenting. And so as we enter into that space with shed practices, we can become more empathetic people, merciful to others. Anyway, so as you come to the passage, you might think of more contrasts that are helpful, but as I end always, glory be to God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be,